What you're looking at right now are the four horsemen of the apocalypse, because Diablo 4, as you know it, is quite literally a dead game. Because the changes coming in Season 4 are insane, and the entirety of the game is different from what you know right now. For all intents and purposes, we are quite literally playing Diablo 4 2.0, and it goes so much deeper than just itemization. So what I want to do in this video is just very quickly touch on my thoughts about the campfire chat that everybody just watched. You're going to be seeing a lot of videos like this coming out from a lot of creators. And just to like TLDR at the beginning, I think this is an insanely huge win for the game, and it basically is bridging the gap between the things that have been objectively missing from the game as we knew it, and is doing so much more work than anybody's like wildest imaginations had walking into this stream. So I just want to touch on probably the biggest things. I'm going to do much deeper dives into each one of these systems as the days go on. We're going to get more information. We're going to get the patch notes into the PTR, etc. But just like pound for pound, the most excited I've been for this game, even since before the game came out and we got into the closed beta. So there are basically like 3 or 4 key points that most people are going to walk away from with this campfire chat, and I'll just list them off very quickly and tell you why they excite me and the different aspects about it and what you might not have caught. So first and foremost, obviously we're getting itemization changes. Items 2.0 or loot 2.0 is a long-standing term that related to Diablo 3 and when that game ultimately got its massive rework of items, and we're seeing that here now as well. And it's touching on every single aspect of the game, aspects included in there as a proper noun, but quite literally how we experience the game in every shape and form. So let's just like touch on the key points from itemization changes that you should be aware of. The first big thing to touch on is aspects. Aspects have generally been plaguing the characters playing this game for a very long time. You would find a perfect roll of it early on. You wouldn't be able to use it or put it onto a piece of gear because it didn't have good enough stats. And they're basically resolving all of this. They're getting them out of your stash page. You literally can't even create an aspect crystal anymore, and we won't need an aspect inventory either. The long and short is when you find an item, a legendary item that has an aspect on it, the moment that you salvage it, that gets added into your Codex of Power. And what you're looking at right here, gameplay that we saw where we were actually going through the Codex of Power, you can search it via a filter, you can favorite things, so if you're using aspects all the time, you can look at aspects that you recently unlocked, and you can look at aspects that specifically come from dungeons. And let's just use the example of Edge Masters right here. When you find a perfect Edge Masters, meaning a 20% roll on Edge Masters, and salvage it, you will fully unlock that value of the aspect and be able to craft that onto any piece of gear that you want that you normally could forever. You don't need to hold on to multiple aspects. This also isn't even per character. It is per softcore or hardcore. So if you're on a seasonal character and you unlock a bunch of aspects for your Druid, but some of them were, you know, like generic class aspects, when you go play your other character, those aspects will be there as well. So just like pound for pound, probably one of the more impactful things as this changes how we interact with gear, it changes how we interact with looking at loot in general, just a massive W. The other cool part about this is that they actually, and I guess this could be a complete second point, they have opened up trading. They've opened up trading so you can now trade rare, legendary, and unique items. You can't trade uber unique items, but you can trade any of the other ones. What that means is if I find a perfect roll of whatever, an umbral ring or a splintering aspect for the Necromancer, I can now go trade that legendary piece of gear to somebody else who is looking for it. Aspects are going to be empowered as you go up through world tiers. So world tier 1 and 2, you'll find a certain range of it. World tier 3, you'll find a stronger one. And world tier 4 is where you'll find perfect aspects. So if you run all the way up to world tier 4 as fast as possible, you can effectively corner the market on people looking for legendary aspects with perfect rolls to be able to sell to people at the beginning of the season. And you'll also just be able to go ask people, hey, do you have an extra one of these rolls? Did you find one while we were playing together? And just add that to your Codex of Power by trading it from another character. So aspects, inventory management, trading, all kind of bundled up into one with this huge change to the Codex of Power. And then the other cool part about it is it does allow you to have this like actually collect them all, this like completionist way of playing the game. And that may not sound super important for some people, but remember, I come from playing Diablo 2, which had the Holy Grail, like literally collecting one of every single item. And you could go out and theoretically collect one of every single perfect aspect. This could be something that you work on your like eternal character as well. There's like, that's a very small footnote, but it is nice to actually be able to like complete the game in that way if that's something that inspires you or empowers you to keep playing. The second big point is tempering. Tempering is a new system of being able to craft affixes onto gear that you want. The big thing to know here is that rare gear now only rolls with 2 affixes, meaning 2 different stats, and legendary gear rolls with 3, which means that rare gear now actually has like a progression standpoint where you will go from using rare gear to never picking them up ever again, meaning you don't have to look through as much loot, which is pretty great. And then you are able to take that rare piece of gear and you have a chance of being able to add 2 additional affixes to it. So in this regard, if I had a weapon, I could add on the ability for my bone spirit to have a larger explosion size. The affixes that you add from the tempering system will be more unique than the affixes you typically find on gear. And then there's a lot of caveats for how the system works. Again, I'm going to go into that detail in another video. What this means is that you're going to find a legendary piece of gear, have 3 affixes that you want. You can keep re-rolling one of those affixes at the occultist like you normally would. Then you can slap on 2 tempered affixes onto it and basically craft a perfect piece of gear for the exact stats that your character needs, beginning the journey to actually having like endgame chase and build diversity when it comes to being able to craft your gear to fit your playstyle. Now, that being said, there's obviously still going to be a meta. There's going to be best combinations of things. That's always the case. But if you just say like, hey, literally all I care about is hitting movement speed cap on my character, you could just keep trying to temper on mobility onto both your amulet and your boots or whatever items they're able to go onto and make yourself the speediest little necromancer in the game if that's all that you care about. And I think that this is like the first big step for this game to legitimately have crafting, since it's legitimately actually crafting. It's very different than what we had before, which was just take a piece of gear, re-roll 1 affix. If it's good, upgrade it a couple times, and then throw an aspect on it. Now it is like customized pieces of gear that you find to fit your playstyle for the build that you're currently playing. And that's just like so good that it's finally there. Yes, it sucks that it wasn't here the entire time, but I'm of the opinion that better late than never, honestly. They're basically adding in primals from Diablo 3, and you're going to hear a lot of people basically comparing a lot of this to Diablo 3, and it's because it turns out that they had a lot of cool systems in Diablo 3 and just in modern ARPGs in general that were sadly missing from the game, and now we're getting them. But what this boils down to is that an item is able to drop with a greater affix. What that means is that when you see it on the ground, you're going to see this little icon. They have like the Roman numeral 2 here. That means 2 out of the 3 stats on here are max power and have a 50% multiplier on them. So if we look at the example, you'll see here that while the lucky hit chance on the piece of gear is normal, it rolled 8 to 10, you'll see this little red indicator on the intelligence and the critical strike damage. And this is 50% higher than the normal max intelligence roll, as well as 50% higher than of the normal critical strike damage roll. So a perfect piece of legendary gear will have 3 greater affixes on it that are all 50% higher than what they normally would be. And one of the big things that they touched on here was this idea of actually making items dropping on the ground be exciting for the player. So if you are still in the early part of like the end game progression, you're just looking for ancestral pieces of gear just to get the stats that you need. But for that end game chase, for that ability to find and continue to farm and to feel good about farming, anytime that you drop an item that has 1 to 3 greater affixes on it, you're going to get that little dopamine hit, that you're going to get that like big, oh shit, like experience, something that I think has generally been missing from the game, but it's something that you would experience all the time in like Diablo 2. You would see a legendary, or you would see like a unique item drop, and you'd be like, oh snap, I know that that's the one that I want. The moment that a pair of gloves drops that has a Roman numeral 3 next to it, you're like, oh damn, this is a chance for me to have effectively a perfect piece of gear to begin crafting on. And I think that out of everything, the hype moment that this is going to add to the game, again, is something that's been like sorely missing, that not enough people will be excited about until you start experiencing it. And I'm just like, I'm excited to pick up pieces of gear now. And it also means, again, if you're like running through, you're on endgame gear and you're like, I literally don't care about an item unless it has 3 greater affixes on it. The moment a piece of gear drops on the ground, if you don't want to worry about like salvaging it or selling it, if you don't see that Roman numeral 3, you just keep it moving, which is pretty dope. Now, that being said, people basically are never going to achieve having perfect gear like during a season at this point. Although, well, you can trade them. Interesting. Maybe I take that back. The majority of people are never really going to have perfect gear because of how many variables are being added to the game, which I do think is a good thing. It has like an actual drive and a thing to strive for, but you basically know whether or not a piece of gear is even valuable to you, depending on your progression point, just it dropping on the ground at all, which is like a pretty big quality of life change. Interesting things to understand about it really quickly. One, if you have a greater affix and you try to re-roll it at the occultist, while you can re-roll into a different stat, so you had cooldown reduction, but you wanted maximum life for whatever reason, you can't re-roll it into a greater affix. So what that basically means is that you have to find it with the greater affixes that you want, as opposed to being able to craft into them later. So like pieces of gear will have legit chaseability as well as huge trade potential, because you may find a piece of gear that has 3 greater affixes that you don't personally want, but somebody else does want for their build or whatever they're doing. And that thing is going to be so insanely rare that being able to sell it for huge amounts may let you buy into pieces of gear that other people have. Just trading in general, again, is going to like wildly change the landscape of this game. And this feeds into that system too. Masterworking is the end all be all of the crafting system and the further like extrapolation of that endgame chase. The long and short of it is you can now upgrade a piece of gear up to 12 times. Every 3 times that you upgrade it, you're going to increase all of the base stats on it. And that includes any tempered stats. So you'll see this little anvil here is like the tempering icon. It'll increase all of the stats on the piece of gear. On the 4th, 8th, and then 12th final masterworking that you do, you have a chance to crit. Crit will increase one of the stats even further. You can hit the same stat 3 times. You can hit 3 different stats. You can hit one stat twice, then another stat once. And what this means is that after finding your perfect piece of gear with greater affixes and then hitting your 2 temper rolls on it that you actually want, you then have this huge like 1 in 5, 3 times of literally getting a perfect piece of gear. The cool thing about tempering, the thing we were just talking about, is that has a limit. So you're only able to re-roll tempered stats like 4 or 5 times. It has a tempering durability, basically, you know, like we've seen this in other games, right? And what that means is that you can brick items. But once you're onto masterworking, you can redo your masterwork. You can reset the item completely. It'll still have the greater affixes. It will still have the tempered affixes, but you can then try to roll your luck again and masterwork it 12 more times. What this means is that if you actually find like your perfect piece of gear, you aren't screwed by random chance. You can continue to like soak and spend resources here to inevitably get the thing that you want. Yes, it's RNG based. Yes, it does mean that like some people won't hit it right away. But what it also means is that those like few times when you successfully crit 3 times on a particular stat, or you get the perfect combination of 2 and 1 on a different one, it's going to like, it's going to be those like dropping actual Tyrael's Might back in Diablo 2, although they did add Tyrael's Might to the game now too. It's a pretty interesting item. We'll talk about the implications of it later. But when you dropped like these ultra rare items in other games, you got to have this moment of like, wow, I've never seen this before. And we just get to effectively inorganically create those moments as well by being able to continuously spend into the system until you get the perfect item. So that just like that effectively fully encapsulates the changes to itemization as it stands. We're actually getting real crafting. We're getting the ability to like fundamentally produce a piece of gear that fits a niche role outside of the normal limitations of what that gear does. Aspect grind is no longer like absolute trash city, and gear is inherently more valuable, will take less time to look through it all, will interrupt the gameplay flow less, and give you legitimate things to strive for in the end game, on top of the end game systems that they added, which I guess will be the next point that we're going to talk about. So the first big change coming to Endgame is that they're like massively overhauling the relative value of like all overworld content, but most notably what we saw gameplay for was in the Helltides. So Helltides now is just literally scarier. You just saw that like a hell spawn worm shot out and just spat elite monsters all over you. They're adding in new interactable things that will spawn events, more random ambushes, more things to interact with. You'll notice that there's this like I forget what they called it, but basically a health bar that as you complete more actions in a Helltide will level up the difficulty, which will then spawn in a special event as well. And then it bleeds all the way back down until you build it up again. So not only is playing in the Helltide getting you the stuff that it normally got you, but also is now just like literally scarier, harder, and more valuable. On top of that, they basically took the best thing from Blood Harvest in season 2 which was the ability to create a localized event to be able to spawn a boss and get a ton of loot. And they're just adding that into Helltide as well. Basically, like, Helltide sounds like just off the rip infinitely more fun to participate in, on top of the fact that they made it so that any monster that's above level 55 can now drop in uber unique, which will always be at max stats. The fact that any monster that's over level 95 will always drop max item power gear, meaning that in world tier 4 in this Helltide right now, every single piece of gear that you pick up may be a best in slot piece of gear, as opposed to randomly getting like, you know, like normal unique items or normal legendary items or even sacred. On top of that, they made it so that sacred items only drop in world tier 3 and ancestral items only drop in world tier 4. So now you're not going to find your best gear by the time you're level 80 and then like just walk into world tier 4 and be like, oh, cool, I have no item progression to chase. And it also means that, again, every single piece of gear that you pick up like from this content right here has a value, has a potential, can be traded, etc. So all of that is like phenomenal. They also showed us a couple interesting things to kind of note here. There's a placeholder heart. They didn't touch on what this is. I assume it's a seasonal thing, but they didn't touch on it. So before you ask, like, no, we didn't see it, who knows? But like just this right here, right? Like this random spawn in of the Helltide Harbingers. These are typically the monsters that you want to kill to be able to get Forgotten Souls. They also made it so that Forgotten Souls drop off of all elite monsters at a low chance across the board, and that they also drop from Whispers. So you don't only have to do Helltides to get Forgotten Souls at a decent rate, meaning that you're not tied to this particular event type if you don't want to. But I think they also show, let me just skip to it very quickly. They also showed this. So on top of all of this, you are also able to run into Bloodseekers, another great addition from Season 2. And the Bloodseeker type monster here, very similar to like the nasty malignant heart monsters that spawn at the end of events like World Boss, as well as just like completing a vault or something like that. Bloodseekers will now spawn into the area. Being able to kill them will also award you Lord Zir materials, which is something that like has been a pain point in general for players. There's so much to talk about Endgame. I'm going to try to get less granular in detail, but it's just like insane how much of it's being added here. They're adding in a new Uber boss. They're finally adding in Andariel as an Uber boss. So very similar to Uber Duriel, you'll be able to farm Andariel mats. So those are the Beast in the Ice, as well as Lord Zir will drop the mats to be able to spawn Andariel. Andariel has the same loot table as Duriel. So if you're just sick and tired of doing Duriel, or you're sick and tired of doing Helltides as well as Varshan and Whispers, you can instead do Nightmare Dungeons to do Beast in the Ice, as well as farm out Lord Zir mats, which have some overlap with Helltides now, obviously. And then you can farm Andariel instead. Andariel also has some new attacks added to it, which you might not have noticed. So the actual character model is different than the Andariel we fight in the game. It is instead much more like the Diablo 2 Andariel. And then on top of that, just at the very end, she does a cool little Poison Nova right here. Very classic from Diablo 2. So it's awesome to be getting a different Uber boss. And then on top of the Uber bosses, just like what we're generally talking about there, all of the endgame bosses, Varshan, Grigor, as well as Beast in Ice and Lord Zir, now all have a chance of dropping Uber uniques as opposed to just from Duriel. And then on top of that, we are able to juice bosses. We're going to be able to fight, I think they referred to them as tormented versions of bosses, which are level 200 versions of them, drop significantly more loot, and then after you kill any one of them for the first time, so Grigor one time, Varshan one time, Beast in the Ice up to 6, each one of them will drop you 1 resplendent shard, meaning that going through and killing at least 4 of these juiced up bosses will allow you to craft any uber unique that you want in the game at least one time during the season and get you halfway to being able to spawn a second one. And they're jumping into something called the Pit right now. And let me just skip over to where they actually show us gameplay of the Pit. The Pit is effectively Greater Rifts from Diablo 3, kind of exactly like Greater Rifts. You have a timer, you have to beat the timer to be able to go to a boss and kill the boss. There are, I think, 200 levels of the Pit. The monsters in the Pit are going to be able to reach all the way up to level 250. Completing the Pit at higher ranks are going to get you the materials that you need for Masterworking, making Masterworking a strictly endgame like item progression and overall power progression for your character system, because you have to do the Pit to be able to do that. On top of that, when you fight bosses in the Pit, and they show us gameplay of that as well, I'll skip to it. But on higher levels of the Pit, literally other bosses will make appearances on top of the one that you're going to fight at the end of your particular run that just like harass you the entire time, which I think is pretty cool. I know nobody really likes getting harassed, but let me just show it to you. So going into this boss fight, so we're fighting the sharpshooter, right? This is like a boss that we always see, but then you'll notice that we have this ghost appearance, kind of like Lilith's like shadow attack that happens in the Echo of Lilith fight in phase 2. But this is the succubi at the end of some of the campaign dungeons that you would fight, and they just also do their attacks that you need to be aware of while fighting this boss, with the challenge getting harder and harder, with the monsters continuing to scale higher and higher, and giving us an endgame content to actually use our insanely high scaled endgame gear against to accomplish. And again, you get better rewards from completing the pit at higher levels, with more legendary items and unique items dropping, etc., etc. This isn't a replacement for something like Nightmare Dungeons. Nightmare Dungeons are still where you're going to go to get glyph experience and anything that they might add in season 4 as the seasonal content, which, keep in mind, we literally didn't even see the seasonal content yet. This was just about core gameplay mechanics and content and systems that are being added without any of this being locked to the season. It's all on Eternal as well. That was like the most insane thing about the stream. It was nearly 2 hours of just, hey, we have fundamentally changed the game, and we're not even into what's going to be in the season yet, which is bananas. But yeah, so like the pit is now an actual end game grindable system. It's not infinite like in Diablo 3. We don't have like infinite Paragon progression or anything like that. It has an endpoint, but they said monster level 250. I don't know how much armor you need to cap out against a monster level 250, but it's sure going to be interesting to see the builds that can effectively do it at that range. They were liking it a lot to the difficulty of Abattoir of Zir, which is something that once it was removed from the game, the people who enjoyed it were really reminiscent of. They really wanted to have that level of difficulty added back into the game, and it sounds like we're getting it with the pit. So the last thing, and I won't go into an excruciating amount of detail here because we quite literally just didn't get a lot of it, but there are also a huge amount of class updates. With the game fundamentally changing like this, with like power progressions being fundamentally different, what skills need to do to be interesting, what aspects need to do to be interesting, what items need to do to be interesting, the classes are obviously going to experience a vast change in power, effectiveness, etc. And we'll show off this uber unique as well while we're sitting here. Tyrell's Might, baby. Really cool. A very interesting item, though, because you have to remember that for a unique item, you actually can't temper stats onto it, but they always come with 4 affixes. And then on top of that, you can masterwork a unique item, so you can actually increase some of these stats 3 times. So in the case of Tyrell's Might, I don't know if my big head is blocking it. Yeah, I am. But you can get all resistance rolls on it, damage reduction, which apparently is going to become a much more rare stat than it currently is right now. But you can also get maximum resistances on it, and critting 3 times on this may bring your maximum resistance up to like a pretty ridiculous value that it otherwise normally couldn't get up to. So I'm excited to see what that looks like. But when we're talking about class balance changes, they kind of wanted to hammer on a couple things here. One, they understood that there were a lot of things that now underperformed because they had effectively become not trivial, but they have been eclipsed by other options in skill trees. So they give a really good example of a Druid ability where they basically took both of the previous modifiers that you could put and just put them together. So as opposed to picking like Supreme or Powerful or whatever the Druids ones are called, they put 2 of them together and just created a whole additional new one that changes up the relative value of those skills. They also wanted to call out the fact that, like, yes, there are some bug fixes that are coming. Obviously, some of these things will be seen as nerfs, but the thing that I would basically recommend everybody do is, even once we get the patch notes, right, which are going to be coming out in roughly a week from today's video, if you're watching right now, that date is the 20th, because I realize people might be watching this tomorrow as well. But with items changing the way that they are, the grind of the game changing the way that it is, the meta progression changing how it is, looking at any one individual change to a class, you effectively can't even know whether or not it is a nerf or a buff, because you don't know how it now works into an effectively different game. So once we get that information, it'll be a little bit more clear, but we're obviously going to be able to play all this in the PTR. But what they wanted to do is take things that like kind of didn't make sense, make them better or make them work properly, fix bugs that they are aware of, but also make the decisions that you're making in the skill tree more impactful than they were previously. They give us a couple different examples, most notably for the Necromancer, and this is like a crazy huge W for the Necromancer, something I've been screaming about for a while, and I know a lot of other people have. Necromancer minions and just minions in general now inherit 100% of the stats from the character. So it's no longer a question about whether or not this stat is valuable for me or for them. You get the stat, they get the stat. So bare minimum, like right here, they're talking about it. Minions now inherit 100% of their player stats. This brings up the interesting question about how they're going to change some aspects. We recently got the Hardened Boned aspect, which says that the Necromancer gains 20% damage reduction and our minions gain 20% damage reduction. And if they now gain 100% of our stats, this now just says we gain 20% damage reduction and they gain 40%. Almost certainly these things will have been changed in some way, shape, or form. Or minions are just going to be disgustingly busted. I'm personally going to be revisiting minions right now in Season 3 to get a build together for like what you should expect. So look forward to that video coming out soon, because obviously we just got a bunch of buffs for them. But I want to be ready and know what I want to test in the PTR to be able to see how good they are. But they're just basically kind of making changes across the board to make things more impactful, better, more valuable, etc. And then the last thing, just to top this all off, because it's very specific to a smaller amount of the player base, but it is very important. Hardcore Diablo 4 is actually hardcore now, as opposed to just softcore with extra steps. They are removing the elixir that stopped you from dying once after you consumed it. So now in hardcore, if you die, you're dead. It's actually a hardcore experience. I know for people who currently play hardcore, that might come as a bit of a shock, but I think the majority of people who are looking to have a hardcore experience in a Diablo game were expecting that if you die, you're gone. And now you are. The reason why I really wanted to highlight this in this video that's talking more about like overarching systems and general concepts is because it shows a commitment to making the game that the player base wants to play, as opposed to sticking to ideas that the developers had that they thought were cool. And I think that a return to form for Diablo games in general is something that a lot of people are hoping for or are calling for in different ways. You know, when somebody says, I want this, a lot of what they're talking about is I want this experience that I know works well in this game. And removing the elixir of like death evasion, whatever it's called. I've never played hardcore because I'm too much of a little baby to do it. I don't like losing my character. I have content to make. You know, screw me down in the comments. I don't really care. Hey, enjoy the way that you play the game. But it is very refreshing to see this thing. And this also touches on something that I generally just wanted to bring up here. Already in chat. I think the vast majority of people who are watching this while we were restreaming it live, and even in the Diablo chat on Twitch, which is normally an absolute cesspool of just crying babies. It is insane. If you ever want to like feel better about yourself, go watch the live chat during a Diablo live stream, at least before today. It's bananas. Even they were calling this a W of a campfire chat. It was like so good to see people like recognizing the strides those developers are making and how good it is. But one of the pervasive comments I was seeing was, this already should have been in the game. Hey, I think we all agree, right? That's why we've all been calling for it. And I think the developers also agree. And that's why they're putting it in the game. So while it's very easy to discount what we're seeing here as like, it should have already been there. Yeah, that's a perfectly redundant and obvious statement. We all agree, and now it's here. I think the only L really that you could take away from this is, one, the new season is going to be pushed back. So season 3 was supposed to end on April 16th, I believe, but instead is going to be on May 14th. And the PTR is going to be on April 2nd. It's going to run for 1 week, all the way up to April 9th. And while this stinks, right, like that's not great, the developers were very honest and clear about this. One, they literally need more development time. Literally during the stream while they were trying to show off one of the tempering things, Bloodshed clicked a thing and the game client crashed. They quite literally just need more development time. But on top of that, they want to implement a lot of the changes that are going to be coming up from the PTR. There are going to be forms that you can actually fill out and send in your feedback. So I would highly, highly, highly call upon anybody who is legitimately invested in this game being the best game that it possibly could be to play the PTR and send in your feedback. Even if it's just a specific thing that you touched on, etc. I would highly recommend it. Make your voice heard. This is our game to play and their game to develop for us. But they were straight up honest about it. They need more time, and I'd rather them take the more time and make it good than take the less time and make it bad, because that's how we got the launch of the game, right? They clearly needed more time and they didn't have it, but now they are and they're taking it, and I'd rather that be the case. So that's the end of it. Those are like the big ticket items that you kind of need to walk away from this. My personal opinion, game is saved. Even me, and everybody knows me, right? Big old corporate chill MacroBioBoi. I am not ashamed of that. I love this game. I love playing this game. It's my favorite Diablo game. My problem has been not everybody can enjoy playing it in the way that they want to. And on top of that, it's even lacking things that I personally would want. And I think that the changes coming just in this season are wildly pushing us in the correct direction. And I want to make sure that as many people are heard and as many people are taken into account when it comes to the direction of this game moving forward. So participate in the PTR, make your voice heard, come hang out with me if you're doing it. I'm going to be streaming the entire thing. I'm going to try to stream like 20 hours a day. I have a day job. I'm not going to take off time because I think I already took off too much time from my day job. But I'm going to try to be streaming this as long as I can, testing as many things as I can, updating as much of our information as possible. And I would love to have you here as well. So come check me out either on Twitch or on YouTube. I stream on both of them. I'll be putting go live notifications all the time. You can come hang out in the Discord. I have a ton of channels there, a lot of nerds who just love talking about what they do. But there you go. That's my recap for this massive W. I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. What more could they be doing? What do you think they missed out on? Do you think that there are better ways to implement stuff? Make your voice heard down in the comments as well. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that it helps. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.